Okay, so here we're going to talk about the big long rigging process that I went through. The rigging process, I thought, was pretty well sorted around about May, maybe even before that, February. The problem is that with rigging, you end up not really knowing what works until you essentially try it a lot. Uh, and it's a process of having to create some animation. It's a process of having to test the character in different poses. Um, and in many ways, some of the issues that I ran into after my initial rigging had completed in February were a lot of these cleanups. But the cleanups themselves take quite a bit of time. And I haven't really ever had to take a character this complex through to this level of completion before. So that also was a challenge, and I wasn't really sure how long that was going to take. So some of the things that I mean by extra cleanups. First off, right now what we're doing is we're looking at our character in just the high resolution version. So if let me see what I have here. I have a high res version and I have a low res version. And in the other version of this, we can see that I've actually cut up just the parts that are actually exposed skin that won't be covered by clothes. I leave those as high res, and everything that's going to be underneath the clothes I leave as low res, and that's to reduce the number of polygons in the scene, which helps to make things go faster and make the scene not quite so big. It just also helps to generally make some of the calculations for clothes and whatnot a little bit easier. There aren't as many polygons to count and simulate and all those sorts of things. So what I did was, let's just say, for example, that I rotate my foot backwards, like this, and there is a particular shape that needs to be created here, where the buttock and the back of the thigh and whatnot, the quadricep, is just sort of pinching like that in a good way, the proper way, and that there's a proper shape that's going on right here in the front. Well, that doesn't automatically happen when you create your rig. It doesn't happen when you bind the skin to the rig. These are what we call corrective blend shapes, and they are shapes that basically, the default skinning that we put on this usually looks pretty bad and has to be cleaned up quite a bit. And the only way that you really know how much of that type of cleanup you need to do is to position the body in a whole bunch of different orientations and whatnot. So like a really good example of that would be if I took this and I brought it out like this. Now, even here doing this is still not perfect, but the a shape right here, this is quite a difficult shape to get correct. And I'm not even sure if it's actually correct in even this particular version of the file, but you get a lot of collapsing that happens here, and it's a weird thing to have to deal with. But you basically have to export a copy of the mesh in that position, and I bring it into ZBrush and I resculpt it in ZBrush to fix the problem. Now, just bringing that back into Maya, I have to go through a process of setting up a blend shape that is based on that particular pose. And that whole process is what's known as a pose space deformer. It deforms based on a particular orientation of a pose. And so whenever the leg goes out, and rotates a certain number of degrees on a particular control, for instance, then that particular blend shape will be triggered. And in order to do that, though, to base our to be able to go into ZBrush and model the change in the corrective blend shape versus what it looked like originally, when I bring it back into Maya, I can't just use the new corrective blend shape because it's already in. Technically, that corrective blend shape is already in this pose, right? For instance, the leg would already be out here like this. And that's not what I want, because a blend shape has to be based on the difference of that particular shape from the default shape. But because we're doing this in pose space, we created that with the leg out here, extended in this direction, which is already adding on to the change from the original to begin with. So we have to be able to subtract that out as well. We have to have a way that we can get back to what does this shape look like if it's just a calculation based on the difference in the resculpture from the new blend shape compared to the original base pose, minus, in this case, the rotation of the leg. And so that took me a while to figure out how to do. In fact, I had to find a script that would allow me to do that. And I did, fortunately. I came across this extract deltas script, which, so I try to find this real quick here, just so that I can reference it. Extract deltas. I think it's by Brave Rabbit. I think this is the one here. Yeah, I was using these tutorials here, and just see who this is that's recording it. It's Andrew Silke, or Andrew Silk. I believe he's a Kiwi guy, actually. He sounds Kiwi. So if we go to maybe he's maybe he's German. It is a German website actually, but he does sound Kiwi somehow. So braverabbit.de, and he's got a more updated version of this called Shapes now, which I think does a lot of things. But the original script that I had was just extract deltas, and that might be from the downloads here somewhere. Let's see if it's, yeah, plugins, extract deltas. Here we go. All right, there's not, well, there's nothing really right there, is there? Okay, here we go. It's a plugin for Maya which helps with the creation of corrective blend shapes to improve the overall deformation in conjunction with regular skinning. All right, so this was an absolutely essential tool that I needed. And it took me a while to figure it out, took me a while to find it, took me a while to even realize that this is what I needed, because I had to do a lot of experimentation to figure out why I couldn't get the result that I wanted. And that was frustrating for a few weeks. I don't know exactly how long it took me, but it took me more time than I would have liked to have spent on it. So once I did that, I fortunately had a solution, a working solution. And in fact, if I show you, if I open up ZBrush here and show you the kind of workflow that I was creating for this, we'll see more or less what this actually looks like. Let me just pause the video real quick. Okay, so here we are. We have our mesh in here, and in fact, the mesh is a little bit odd in the sense that I've actually got a high resolution and low resolution mesh sort of sitting on top of each other. And I just did it that way because when I first started doing this, I didn't know whether or not I would need to create a blend shape for both high res and low res for every pose, depending on how the poses might get used later. I tried to give myself that option. Ultimately, in the end, it wasn't tremendously necessary, but I did, because I started that way, I had to kind of leave it that way. And I can selectively edit whichever one I want by properly clicking on it or going between the two. So, like I said, most of the ones that are the high resolution, they're just sort of, like imagine the neck being cut sort of like right that, and so it'd be from there upwards, that would be the head, and then it would be things from like the wrist down to the hand. And everything else is going to be basically just in this low resolution version because it's all going to be covered with clothing. All right, so if we, for instance, take a look at our, I don't know, any one of these. There's a lot of them, as you can see. It's probably more important that I just show you what a bunch of these are. So if we look at T-pose clavicles, all right, the what this is I've raised just the clavicles here, and so every one of these poses, it's really quite important to point out that they're based on the movement of just one part of one control, one animation control. In order to do this properly, that's what you need to do. And again, that was another thing I had to practice with, is saying, all right, can I spread this across more than one animation control, or do I have to like keep it to just one? And ultimately, I realized that it was just one, which is kind of difficult for certain movements, like putting your arms above your head, because that actually you can't really totally separate that. In order to get, to raise your arm above your head, the first thing that you really do move in that process are your clavicles of, raising up this area here. And then the shoulders and everything else can move up. So it's not a process that is totally separable. So that definitely required some thinking and practice around and experimentation to get right in terms of, one, what are the correct shapes that I need to create so that I can make sure that this process looks correct the whole time that it's occurring. And then another thing is to be able to figure out how to break that down from the rigging point of view inside of Maya. Because I realized that was a difficult thing, I did for a while experiment around with creating a muscle system. In fact, if I can try to find that here. I don't know if I still have that on. Yeah, I do actually. Oops. Allegedly, I still have muscles in here somewhere. I do. There we go. So if we take a look at this, I experiment around with creating a muscle system based on some tutorials, and I had no previous experience of working with muscles. And I spent, I don't know, a few days on this, just learning how they worked and creating a dynamic system, which is pretty cool. I mean, it does do a lot of things that, helps to deform things properly. However, part of what I was hoping to achieve by doing the muscle system was to limit how much extra skin weights I'd have to paint, because I always hated painting skin weights. I was hoping that it was going to sort of solve some of that, the skin weight issues that I normally ran into for me. And I realized that in order to really properly adhere the muscles to the skin, I have to paint muscle weights. So it's really not really anything that's an improvement. I still had to paint areas of influence. So I lost a couple days there, but I learned a little bit about it. So I'll turn those off, turn this back on. All right. I was just hoping that maybe that would give me, because the way muscles work is that they're a dynamic calculation. So if the character is moving around and there's a little bit of wiggle going on in the muscles, you'll probably see that kind of coming through underneath the skin, which would be nice. It's not something that I'm going to get automatically using blend shapes, unfortunately. However, much of that movement is going to be covered by the clothing anyway, so it's probably not that big of a loss. Now, as I was saying, if we just go through here, there are a bunch of different poses. So, as I said, T-pose clavicle. And then I had to come up with what is the fix going to be, because this is what it looks like as it comes out of Maya. And it might be easier to just take a look at the high-res version here. So this is just a default pose, an A pose. And now this is the T pose. And that's without any change. That's just like rotating up the A pose. But what ends up happening is that there are some areas here that don't look correct. And even you can see underneath here, we're getting some deformations that are ugly. We don't want. So if we turn on the fix, now we can see that that's looking better there. We can see better resolution or definition, of the shoulders. We get rid of some of the ugliness under there. Okay, and so that's kind of what we're trying to achieve with each of these poses, is just cleaning it up so that we don't rely on just the defaults. And so there are, lots of things where it's collapsing, especially wherever the skin gets close to other parts of the skin. And if we put, shoulders into T-pose, for instance, and I just turn this on, right? Now, in fact, actually, this is a complex one, because this one requires this requires both the clavicles on and the shoulders on in order to look right. Right. Now, a quick discussion about this is that the model was, it was originally modeled in T-pose, to be honest. But I then realized that this particular pose here is what people most often create but it's not really tremendously accurate in terms of the location of the clavicles, especially because ultimately those clavicles are up too high. So if I were to take this pose and use it as my default, and I rotated my arms downwards, I would end up with the problem of having my clavicles continue to be up too high, and that's not what I want. So I started out in the A pose and then created, which would keep everything sort of default down in this very base shape, and I then rotated up the arms and created these fixer shapes essentially. Now, of course, thinking about it now, what I could have done was I could have just kept everything in T pose and then rotated the arms down and created fixer shapes for A pose. And possibly that would have made my life easier. I don't know. Ultimately, it doesn't necessarily matter in the end. I'll get the same result more or less. But it's it's been a lot of learning as I go along in this process, I have to admit. And so this is what I'm getting. So anyway, there are other poses in here, of course, where it's like, the leg back. So this is that same shape that I looked at before. Now, let's do this with here. Now, it doesn't look too different from what I showed before, but if I turn on the fix just sort of fills in some of this volume back here, right? And if I were to go back and take a look at the version 43 that I had here, I think, if I was looking at this properly, and in fact, I'm just going to quickly put this into FK mode, just make things a little bit easier. Okay, yeah, that might be right. Just want to make sure that that was actually looking correctly there. I don't remember where the version of this file was when I switched it out to another version. So you don't always get the same results if you have made the changes later on. I'm using this version of the file because it was pretty close to where I then had to go in and make the absolute final adjustments. All right, so I think that that's probably the majority of things that I need to talk about from ZBrush for now. Yeah, most likely. I mean, there are a few other things that I might end up having to edit later on, and that could include things like the deformation of the fingers, maybe. I'll have to have a look at that. I haven't really brought those in. I can still add those blend shapes in later, because the way that I am editing my file in Maya is that it's all coming in as a referenced rig. So any changes that I make to the original rig file will then get populated into the referenced version later on. So, okay, what other things to talk about here? It's kind of hard to really encapsulate all of the work that's gone into it, because much of it, as I said, is experimentation and failure and having to work things through, and then a process of forgetting what you've done because you were away from it for that particular job for a while. And especially when I went to Europe for a month and came back, and it took me a week or two to really kind of refresh my memory, because even before I went to Europe, I was working on a journal article, and I was kind of away from this project for at least 2 weeks before I left. It's quite a complex thing, and if you aren't doing it every day and really focused into it, you can easily forget what you've been doing. Even when I come back to it a day later, it can still be a little bit of reacquaintance time. And that's because rigging is so procedural. It's so based on what you've done before and making sure you know exactly where everything is. And ultimately, one of the big things that became a problem here that I didn't anticipate entirely was the fact that when I started this project back in 2016, I created not a body, but just a head. It was just the head. So if I turn off I'm just going to turn off things here. Turn off the body. I had just my head model. Okay. And I had rigged that with some controls. In fact, those are these old controls here. There we go. And that was that was because I was doing this. I was using this as a project for my motion capture 3 paper that I teach. And I was demonstrating to them how to model your own head, because that was part of the project. I did not really expect to know what I was doing from the practical side of my PhD at that point. But I did work this into it eventually. It would have been better in hindsight. I mean, it saved me a lot of time and stress and trouble if I had not just done this from a head. I did it this way because I was trying to make things easier for my students. And without knowing it, I was making things more difficult for myself down the line. The model that this is based on originally comes from the free software Make Human. And that just allows you to create a basis, sort of a slider-based program to be able to dial in different facial features and body features. And I used that to create the basis for the head, and then I went in and I really modeled it in a very bespoke way. But I deleted everything except for this part of the neck and the head, essentially. When you delete things in Maya, it changes what's known as the vertex order and the number of polygons and all those sorts of things. So even if I were to go back and try to stitch this onto the body, when I create blend shapes, which are all based on a particular vertex order, since the vertex orders are going to be different, the blend shapes aren't going to work directly. And that created a problem when I was trying to take all of the work that I'd done on this head, which is really, it looked basically the way I wanted it to look for the most part, and then basically have a body along with it. And I didn't want to go back and remodel the head from scratch because it took a long time. It was involved, and I had done all the micro detail. I had created all the UV layouts. I had done a whole bunch of work. So what I decided to do, and we're going to see if this is a wise decision or not. This could be a totally terrible decision down the road, and it's going to really mess things up if it is. But hopefully this will work. Is to use this head as what's known as a wrap deformer for the rest of the body. And in order to do that, I had to create another version of the body from Make Human and attach it to a version of the head. As I said, that creates a problematic vertex order. But as a wrap deformer, it's kind of like, imagine having a really loose skin that you're wrapping over an existing mold underneath. And this head here is the mold that's underneath. And any changes that I make to that mold underneath will then be reflected on the skin that's above it, sitting on top of it. So the new body with the head in the wrong vertex order sits on top of it. And ultimately, those changes, whatever changes I make here, get pushed onto the newer full copy of the body head. And yeah, so there was a tremendous number of challenges with that. That was not a simple process at all, and a lot of experimentation again. But that's, in a very brief way, that's what we're talking about. So it's just one of the deformers here in Maya, just called a wrap deformer somewhere in here. And I never remember what some of these things are. There it is, wrap. Okay. That's just editing it right there. So it's somewhere else to begin with. Kind of bugging me. I can't find it now, but I'm sure it's there somewhere. Okay. So this head is providing that influence. Now, that means that all of the blend shapes that I had created originally, which are on a different model. No, don't save those changes. which are here. So if we go into JSON head sculpt, there we go. This might take a little while to open up. This is a fairly complex head rig, or just head mesh. You can see where I've tried to stretch out my head here to match the contours of the torso. This is the updated head torso that I mentioned before. Now this is probably a couple things I need to mention. One thing I need to mention is the 3D head scans, which hopefully I won't forget. Let's just bring this back up to the top level of resolution. Okay, so actually in this version of the file, I've deleted most other things. So we'll talk about the scan data really quick, because that's what is here. First off, if I turn off this particular layer, this is the one that takes the model in its original orientation, right? And then I try to stretch it down to fit the polygons of this lower resolution mesh, just so that they sit almost seamlessly next to each other, as close to seamlessly as I can possibly get it. So that's one thing. Scan data. Okay, so a quick aside about that. In about February or March, I was invited by one of the professors in the engineering department to use a 3D scanner that they have, a portable 3D scanner, so that somebody could I could just sit there and somebody could scan my head. And I thought that would be a good opportunity, first off, to see how well did my original sculpt that I did, which was just photo-based sculpting, how well did that match up with the reality, so to speak, of the scan. And this scan data here, if we take a look at it real quick. All right, now this is not the direct scan data itself. And you see there's a fairly big difference there between what was the original sculpt and what is the scan data. Now this is a sculpt. I took the scan data, I brought it in, it was an STL file, I brought it into here into ZBrush as an OBJ, and I tried to match up, I tried to take the existing head that I had down here at no influence, and sort of push and pull it until it matched what the scan data looked like. In fact, actually that scan data, do I have it here? Yeah, I do. This is the scan data. All right. Now this is, avoiding the ears and some other things, relatively accurate from a very low resolution kind of perspective. And there's some holes everywhere and whatnot, and the polygons are really big. So this is not something that I could ever use as a, as something that I could animate directly, but it does give me a lot of information, especially things like the back of my head, all those sorts of things. So I just tried to match it one-to-one, and ultimately, somewhere along that process, there's a loss of fidelity of what I was doing compared to what the scan data was, because when I turn this on, that just looks way fatter than this does. And I think it just has to do with some of the finesse of, maybe the indentation under here and a little bit of a flatter plane in some areas, and otherwise things start to look kind of fat and bloated. But I knew this was getting to be a bit more accurate than what my photo-based sculpting had been. And I can just really see the differences overall. So what I did was I said, all right, well, is there any point between not using it and using it at full blast that it looks correct? And I decided, yeah, approximately at 50%, it looks better, right? So if I start going back and forth between those two, to me, it feels more like the actual scan data. And yeah, so I decided to use it at 50%. So that's kind of an important aside there, I think. All right, so if we take a look at another version of this file that was made probably before I put the scan data in, I took out a lot of the layers because the file was getting so huge. It took a long time to load, and it was less stable, and it just took up a lot of space on the hard drive and all that kind of stuff. So that when I was dealing with the scan data and whatnot, I could really speed up my workflow and reduce some of the time being spent. In fact, what size is this file that I just opened? The file is... Okay, so these ones are actually, you can see these are all smaller versions, and that's because those are where I got rid of all the layers. So the last one that had all the layers on it was actually here on the 9th of February. And some of these other dates here just are indicative of me having gone through and working without all those layers. You can see that the biggest version of this file became 3 gigabytes, which is massive. And this just has to do with the number of polygons that I have and how many different blend shapes that I have, where it has to continue to make those calculations each time. So it can get quite unwieldy. It can use up a lot of resources on your computer, and at a certain point, I just had to be careful about that. So let's pause this while it's doing that. Okay, so turn off ears and neck here. Give you kind of an idea of what it is that I'm dealing with all these blend shapes. And most of these, obviously, I had finished well back, when I thought the rigging was done to begin with. But I think maybe I might have added a few in later on, like some of the swallows, the neck strain. I'd gone through and I had figured out that although I thought I had everything, I really didn't. There were still a lot of little things that needed to be added in. And even if I had to still add some more in, I could. It's not too late, because the way that this gets calculated is, first off, it gets calculated on that original just single head mesh, and then that gets, once those calculations are complete, then it gets passed through that wrap deformer onto the full body mesh. So, there are, I don't even know how many different blend shapes there are here in the end, but there's a lot. And most of these ones need to be divided down into a left and right version. So for most of them, there's actually 2 different blend shapes. These were all modeled with me holding a mirror in front of my face while I made whatever the facial shape was. So that took a long time too. Okay, I'm going to close out of this for now and hopefully not cause myself any problems. Where did I leave off here? Sorry, hold on a second. So in this version of the file, I haven't separated the head from the body in terms of what's visible. And just to give you a further idea of what's going on here, Maya may crash when I do this, we're going to find out. There are a bunch of those little blend shapes still in here. So if I look at the body geo, all right, there's a high resolution and a low resolution version of various different blend shapes here. And if I pull back, you can see there's a reasonable number. And these are for various things. Like this one here is arm raised above head right. All right, so that's just for that particular thing. You can see that bulging sort of deltoid there is a fix. And even though this looks really strange underneath here and kind of collapsed and gross, it's actually the correct change. It's the correct, what we call the correct delta for the arm in the position it is when it's up. So it's, that's why I needed this extraction tool, because there's no way I would have ever been able to figure that out on my own. It just would never have worked. It's a mathematical calculation. Some of these ones here, this is leg rotate Z right. And so that's where the leg's kind of coming out here in one of the shapes that I showed before, where it bulges out a little bit more. Right. So Those are just for the body, and I'm not sure how many blend shapes there are there. Let's actually calculate it. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, 35, 36, 37, 38. So that's 38 total. There's 21 high res and 17 low res blend shapes. These ones here, I don't take the blend shapes and directly put them onto the rig that I'm using. I put them onto a sort of a pass-through receiver node. The reason for this is if I need to ever, for instance, if I end up breaking my skinning or my history on my rig, and which can happen and has happened, usually inadvertently, and I need to redo all this. I need to bring all these back in and set everything up the way that it was before. It's a lot easier if I've already brought that onto an unrigged version of the mesh that sits here and absorbs all of that and has on it a node. Oops. So find our blend shape node in here somewhere. There we go. Has on it this blend shape node. So this, as any one of these things gets triggered, right, it creates the change here on this node, and it simultaneously now passes on that change over here. So if this gets nuked in some way, all I need to do is to just set up the connection between here and here again, as opposed to having to take up each one of these and set them up again individually on here, which would be a lot longer process. So this is just kind of a measure that I take to prevent any terrible things from happening down the line, which almost inevitably they always do. So this one obviously is plugged into the high-res version. This guy is plugged into the low-res version. Now, let's turn off that, and let's turn on the head. So the head has two things that have to be turned on in order for this to work, which I sometimes forget which things they are. There we go. All right, the head is way more complicated. In fact, the only way to really see this properly is we take a look at it from the front view. Okay. So the head has several different rows associated with it. Again, this is the pass-through head that gets passed onto not the body that we see there, but rather just the standalone head that I showed you before. So these are all mouths, or basically around the mouth area. This is all around sort of the mid-face area, like the nose. And this is all around the eyes. And all these ones up here are sort of their own little thing. They might be neck, they might be asymmetrical detail. They don't really fall conveniently into any of these three categories. So most of these are left and right versions of the same shape. But if we were to calculate how many total shapes there are, we get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, 35, 36, 37, 38, 39, 40, 41, 42, 43, 44, 45, 46, 47. In fact, let's bring up a calculator to keep track of that. So 47 plus. All right, so that's 47 head shapes. Obviously, not all of them are left and right shapes. There's a couple that are individual shapes, which is why we have an odd number. All right, so here we have sneer. That's just sort of like mid-face around the cheeks area as well. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We get things like sneer and cheek squint, nostril narrow, and nostril flare. All right, now around the eyes and brows region. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34. All right, have that. And finally, these other ones at the top here. We have 4 different swallow shapes here, different shapes that your throat can make when it's swallowing. I have neck strain, so just kind of like when you're really angry and your neck strains a bit. Scan adjust, that's the one that I said was the shape that I put at 50% in ZBrush. And I also put at 50% in here. Bring it in at 100%, reduce it to 50% influence. Head up, that's like rotating it back. Lip corrector, head down, head attached to body, and asymmetrical detail. All right, so we have a total of, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 shapes there. So if we take a look at that, there's our calculation again. 47 shapes down here, 8 shapes here, 34 shapes here, and 12 shapes here. Brings us to 101 facial shapes. Okay, that's a lot. So this goes beyond just the basic fax shapes, but it certainly includes them. And that's all well and good, but it's never enough. Because that still limits us to the kinds of shapes that we can create, which means that the only shapes we can create are the ones that are based on individual blend shapes or combinations of blend shapes. So on top of that, I wanted extra control. So in order to get that extra control, I needed to add in some facial markers. And these exist in addition to everything else. Now, I'm not seeing anything here for some reason. I'm not sure why. I think I had to turn on all of my controls. There we go. Okay, so, here are the basic controls. And each of these controls needs to be able to drive different blend shapes. So if I was, trying to move this up and down now, you'll see, uh-oh, it's not doing anything. There's no influence that it's having on the head. So this is what I do. I usually turn on wireframe unshaded so I can actually see any changes that are happening here. And there's no changes. Now, originally there were changes, but somewhere along the way they got lost. I don't know how. All the work that I did for them just disappeared. I made a change on one thing somewhere, no doubt, and it deleted everything else, and I didn't realize it happened at the time. And then I did a bunch more work, and I didn't want to have to repeat all that work. So I had to go back and re-rig these connections. So a pain in the ass. A continuous pain in the ass rigging is. However, gradually you do learn. All right. And I'm actually going to go into my other rig here in just a second, but just to kind of give you an idea, in order to make this work, what I want to do is, like, if I drag this up here, I want it to influence the brow to go up. And that means that as this goes up, it has to trigger the brow, left brow up shape, blend shape to trigger. And I do that by creating what are called driven keys, where I use my control object here as the driver object. And I say, all right, when that goes up in Y, translate Y, it's going to impact, it's going to come in and impact on one of my blend shape controls, which are all listed here off of this little circle control on top of his head. And so, left brows up, or brows up left, there we go. Like, I would create a connection between when translate Y is in this position, brows up looks like this. But when I drag this up here, I would then be able to cause brows up to increase in value, so that going up and down, I'll be basically increasing or decreasing the influence of this one blend shape. And I do that for all these different controls. And some controls have more individual controls than others. Sometimes it's just a matter of whether or not you're dragging them up and down. Sometimes some controls have things like this that I've added onto them. This is a custom attribute that I've added onto it, blink left, where I can, as I increase the value of this, I'm going to increase the influence of the blink left blend shape. So let's just close out of this real quick and go into our other version of this, which is a more recent version, which is now, hopefully, fingers crossed, the final version. And we can see those various things in action. So if we come out here and let's turn on wireframe unshaded. Now if I grab that control and I pull it up, right, it's a little slow to respond, and that's just kind of the nature of working with driven keys. They're not tremendously fast to respond. But you can see that now that's causing our blend shape to trigger, and in fact, you know, inside here, this will just do one side versus the other. And these are additive, so I can do them at the same time, right? If I really wanted to, I could even add in a little bit of extra overall control if I felt that that was appropriate. I have to look at it from both sides, all that sort of stuff, right? So put everything back down to 0. And I have more controls now around the face than I did before, even in that file. Like I had to add in some cheek controls because I ended up creating some extra blend shapes that were based around the cheek area, and I didn't have any controls that really were a good place to handle that sort of thing. So even like puffing out the cheeks here. So adding in sneers, all those sorts of things, including things like the lips being pulled up or down. So these are all little things that I had to go in and recreate or create from fresh, and make sure that all this stuff was linked back up together again. And that was, it was kind of painful because I had already done this before, most of it at least, and I had to redo it again. And it's time consuming. It's not overly difficult, but it's time consuming. And that's really the annoying thing about this process. It's like I know where it needs to be, but it's time consuming. So something like this control here doesn't move at all. It just really is exclusively for the purposes of you know, being able to trigger blend shapes, specific blend shapes in quite quickly and easily, like swallow, right? There are other blend shapes on here that are based on post-based deformers, so like rotating the head backwards, for instance, making sure that the throat stays straight and that we get kind of this fat roll going on in the back of the neck, those sorts of things. Those don't happen automatically. I have to create blend shapes for those. All right, so as I said, even though I have all these blend shapes in there, they don't give me the amount of control that I really totally want. And that's where these extra markers come in. So these markers provide a very limited range of influence, some a little bit more than others. Like this marker here, I can drag around quite a bit, and I can go in really any direction that I want. I could pull it up. I could even put it back in Z, which I may have to do if I was, you know, trying to make sure that I don't end up making this look like there's no bone there. So the markers give me a lot more free range of control because they're not based on blend shapes. The markers are exclusively joints, basically, that are skinned to the mesh. So underneath this little dodecahedron or whatever the soccer ball sort of thing is that I have here for my markers are actual joints. And so I don't want to move the joints directly because it gets messy. So instead, I just grab this controller here that I have created a constraint between the joint and the controller. And that way, as I move that around, the joint moves along with it. And with the joint moving, that means the influence is being pushed around. The individual vertices that are influenced by that are being moved. Okay, so for each one of those joints, it requires skin weights to be painted. And this is another pain in the ass thing because I had already done this once, and it's one of those things where it got lost somehow, or I don't even remember exactly the entire problem. It just wasn't working properly, and then the skin weights weren't working. And the main thing is that these are, oh, actually I think I know what it is. I think that these are, let's just go and quickly have a look at this. If I go in my skin weights here, trying to find what we have. So left mouth top joint. I don't see any actual weighting happening there. So let's just turn my joints on real quick. And go back to that. There we go. I can see the joints popping up there, but I'm not seeing anything happening directly on them. So if we turn off our body geos, and I turn on my old head geo, because I think this is what was happening here. So what is it? JSON head high res. All right, yep. And see, Maya's going to crash now because it doesn't like this. So I'm just going to pause the video real quick, and I'll reload Maya to show you this. All right, so here we are again. Let's try that again. Hopefully things don't crash. So turn on our head high res. There we go. Cool. And now if I click on that and I go into paint skin weights, no, I don't actually see them there. That's fun. I was wondering maybe part of what we were experiencing last time was something to do with the Maya just kind of giving up the ghost because it was getting overly complex for some reason. Who knows? It does that occasionally when you're running out of memory and whatnot. So interestingly enough, I'm no longer seeing the influences here, which I find so strange. Oh, I know why. Okay. I'd have to find an earlier version of this. In fact, it might not be possible here. Let me see if I find version 44. But here's essentially the deal. What I've done here is I've actually normalized all of the skin weights on the body, and I did that because the skin weights were painted in post, so that their normalization didn't occur until later on. And I was hoping that maybe by doing that, I would speed up some of the playback that I was getting. It doesn't really seem to have worked. It doesn't hurt anything, but it does mean that some of the stuff just gets wiped as far as being super easily editable. Maybe I should go back and find that version. I don't know. I suppose I could probably steal the skin weights from there again. Anyway, so as I'm talking to myself here, the original problem was that these were created to be influenced by to influence the original just head shape that had no body attached to it. And then later on, of course, I wanted them to make sure that they actually influenced not that shape, but rather this shape here, the new shape, which meant that I had to actually reskin them. And I couldn't steal the skin weights from the original version and just apply it to the new version, which would make things so simple and so easy, because there was a different UV layout, and it wasn't really possible to easily recreate that same layout on the new version as existed on the old version. So much bullshit, but it is what it is. And yeah, so now this is what we have. The way this works is, like I said, there's just a very tiny area of influence that is being, that this particular marker is affecting, or any given marker is affecting. So, and ultimately, I would probably never actually move it this much. It's just that if I were to dial in a blend shape that I thought needed a little bit more oomph in a particular area, then that could be very useful. In fact, the areas that I think I will most often use these are probably around the eyes, where I really need to change subtly the shape of the eyelid, because the blend shapes don't give me enough flexibility to really truly manage that. Same thing around the lips, especially as the mouth is open a bit more. These just give me a lot more flexibility about what goes on all around the mouth and the eyes and all those sorts of things. So that is kind of the overall story on on many of these rigging concerns that I had and why things took so long. I'm sure there's more stuff here that I need to talk about, but for now, I will probably stop there. Beyond this, there's of course taking all of the motion builder stuff and being able to apply the motion capture onto the character in Maya, which was in itself its own challenge. But I think I'll talk about that in a separate section. Lastly, just sort of pointing out here, this is just the high resolution version. This is what we can see of it. You can see the hands down there. And then there's the low resolution version, which is there. Separate that so that you see just the low resolution version now. And yeah, so these two are affected by the exact same joints. So as I move, this arm around, for instance, both parts of the body are moving with it. The wrist is coming along, and same thing with the upper torso. Hopefully everything works fine. I always get scared when I do this. I'm like, something's going to break, something's going to go wrong somewhere. But hopefully we've solved all those problems now. And okay, so that's a wrap here, and now it's time to write all this up.